To begin, I'd like to welcome you to the talk, which is about the shifting perceptions of Black print and media, focusing on Flamingo and drum. And we're fortunate to be able to talk about it because of the work that James Barnor did, which is also featured in this exhibition. James was known for approaching women at bus stops and asking them if they would be cover stars, and there's lots of great stories. And so we're using his photography as stimulus to talk about the mechanisms and the controversies behind the magazines, because there's a lot of politics that also happened. And just like Flamingo and Drum, which was an interesting mix of glamour and politics, we're going to try and reflect that here today. To begin, I'd like to introduce our guests. So we have, of course, James Barnor, as we all know, a prolific photographer, Ghanaian and British, and with a portfolio spanning over 60 years from fashion. He was the first photojournalist in Ghana for the Daily Graphic newspaper, covered Drum and Flamingo, amongst others. On my left, we have June Sarpong, the TV presenter, broadcaster, diversity expert, award-winning author, and many things. I'm trying to be succinct. And last but not least, we have Stephen Dorril, who is an academic, a journalist and a writer, and he's written extensively about the British intelligence services and its activities, and was previously associated with Huddersfield University. So to begin our conversation, we have quite a lot of interesting stories to get to this point, including a man called Cameron Dodu. So Cameron Dodu was the editor of Drum magazine Ghana from 1960 to 1965. And although James Barnor and Cameron Dodu never crossed over, they lost touch and hadn't seen each other for 21 years, and we found him just in time for this talk. But unfortunately, he couldn't join us today, so we're starting with him telling us about the period when he was at Drum magazine. We'll play a video, and it's 5 minutes long. So maybe the first question to start with is, how did you mentioned that Jim Bailey was aware of the work that you were doing. How did you meet him? Just tell us about that.
Whilst I was working at Ghana Broadcasting Corporation as a news person, I was also writing short stories for the program section of Ghana Broadcasting. And Mr. Henry Ofori, who was editor of Drum at the time, heard one of my stories, and he was impressed because he was also writing for the radio. And he came to me and asked me to take part in a panel discussion on what is wrong with Ghana's writers. And I told him, and he published it, that people spend so much time trying to earn a living that by the time they get home, they are tired. They can't really put pen to paper. If they do, they can't finish their stories and so on. So I gave him a practical view of what I was experiencing and how I was trying to overcome it. Now, Mr. Ofori published this. And when Mr. Bailey came to Ghana at one time, he wanted to meet people, not necessarily prospective employees, but people who could discuss politics, writing, the arts, and life in general. And Ofori introduced me to him at that time. Now, shortly after that, I was offered a job to go and join Ofori at Drum. But as soon as I mentioned it to Ghana Broadcasting, they doubled my pay. They promoted me, had a car, I was on the list for a bungalow. So I mean, I had jumped right up to the middle class of Ghana. So I couldn't go. I told Drum that the way they had gone out of their way to meet my demands, it would be unfair to just let them, do what they wanted.
So what happened next? How were you convinced?
In the meantime, Drum had been banned in Ghana, but I didn't know. I went around doing my work at Ghana Broadcasting. Then Bailey came back And this time he didn't send a photo, he sent his photographer, a chap called Christian Medbo, to come and see me and bring me to him. And I went and he said, I know that we made you an offer and it wasn't attractive enough, but now I'm prepared to give you an offer that would attract you. So I asked for it and he doubled my pay at broadcasting. Said he would take over my car loan and all sorts of things. And I would be in charge. That is what he said. So it became extremely difficult for me to go back to broadcasting and say, look, 3 months ago, we came to this same impasse and you managed to persuade me to stay. But the situation has changed again. I know you can't go back to the Civil Service Commission and convince them that I'm so precious that they need to redouble the offer that they had given me before at your request. So I just wrote my resignation without discussing it with the Director General of Broadcasting. And I went. Now, when I got to Drum, I realized that I had been tricked because Henry Ofori had resigned and left. He had gone to America because he had been in trouble with the government. And I was the only editorial person in the office.
Wow.
With a photographer. And I had burnt my boats at Broadcasting House. There's no way of going back. So I had to make the best of it. And I stayed for 5 years, 5 turbulent years, 1960 to 65. If you know the history of Ghana, you know that those were very bad years.
So, just for context about Drum Magazine, which is spoken about, it was actually founded in South Africa. It was quite pioneering in black journalism, the first of its kind in many ways. And one of the driving forces behind it was a man called Jim Bailey, who was an RAF pilot. And he led the expansion of Drum across the world, particularly in Africa, including Ghana and Nigeria and Libya and East Africa, etc. Interestingly, that period that Cameron Dodie was editor, 1960 to 1965, was also the time that Flamingo magazine was established in the UK. So there is a bit of crossover, and the best person to tell us about that is Stephen and some of the history.
I think it's interesting how things resonate down the decades. I was walking down Oxford Street this morning and a guy was walking towards me with a T-shirt. And the T-shirt was of Island Records. And it was the original Island label from 1962, white with coral. Island Records was owned by Chris Blackwell, came from Jamaica the year before and started up Island Records. And he introduced ska music to this country, really, from Jamaica. And it so happened, I was a bit shocked because I collect Island Records from that period. But I was also shocked because Flamingo magazine, it's where Island first advertised. When I came across Flamingo magazine, there were this series of adverts for Island Records introducing ska music. So it's an interesting kind of cultural thing. And one of the adverts in it was for a man called Rico. He was a trombone player who was very famous in Jamaica. Almost every ska record made from 1960 to 1962 features Rico. He came over here and he's advertising in Flamingo. I'm a ska musician, is anybody interested? Give me a job. And of course he ended up playing with the Specials 20 years later, so it kind of resonates. But the other thing is that I first came to London in 1962. I was 8 years old. And with my parents, we went to Notting Hill. And I came up out of the tube station at Notting Hill, and there were these men there in long coats with placards saying, "Blacks go home," and things. And I said to my mother, I said, "Who are they?" Because I found it quite frightening. It was kind of dark. They looked sinister, and she said, "They're Mosley's men." And this was not long after the Notting Hill riots and things. That's when, and eventually I wrote a biography of Sir Oswald Mosley. So I was always interested in that. But Flamingo magazine started as a response to the Notting Hill riots. There were a group of, I would call liberal social democrats, politicians, student leaders, who are both in the Conservative Party, Labour Party. Some of them became prominent politicians. Some of them went into MI6. And they were, as I said, liberal. They were very concerned about what was happening. They were anti-racist, anti-South Africa, and anti-communist. And they wanted to do something. And a man called Peter Hornsby, who was a student leader, decided to start a magazine, and the magazine he started was Flamingo. Now, the thing about Peter Hornsby was that he was working for an international student group, COSEC, Coordinating Secretariat, in Holland. And that was financed by MI6 and the CIA. He was an MI6 agent. I was very lucky to speak to his wife, who told me a lot of this, and the meetings they had, and they set it up. And they set this magazine up to kind of integrate West Indians and African refugees coming into the country into British society. But it also had other purposes, which was about talent spotting. Talent spotting black politicians of the future. And there is this very odd thing that British intelligence did. It was even controversial inside the MI6. That is, unconscious agents. You can recruit somebody without telling them. So you recruit somebody and you help them. You help them get a job. You help them get to university. You help them with their career. And then somewhere along the line, you tap them on the shoulder and say, we'd like you to do something for us. And they say, what? Why would I want to do that? And then you say, well, you know that post you got wherever, we got you that post. And now it's your turn to pay us. So they were talent spotting people, particularly students, future leaders in Africa. This is the time of winds of change, and MI6 is sent into Africa for the first time to try and do something about independence, to smooth the way to independence in a number of countries. So they're looking for people. And they're looking for people who are basically in their same kind of view of the world. Again, kind of not communist, anti-communist, liberal, Western orientated. There is an ideological battle going on also with the Soviet Union. There are student groups being funded by the Soviets, there are magazines, etc., and they want to counter this. And Flamingo is part of that. And they set up bank accounts with one particular bank, which I know was linked to MI6. And anybody who's run a magazine, as I've done, knows that it's very difficult. Small-scale magazine, you need money, where's the money coming from, and all of that. And Flamingo thrived for 5 years. It was selling 20,000 copies. It was a popular magazine amongst the West Indian community in this country, and it also became popular in West Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, etc. And Peter Hornsby was the person behind it. He was flying out, and it's very expensive in that period. It's interesting, nobody really questioned where the money was coming from. The editor was a man called Edward Scobie, who had run a magazine previous to that called Tropic. There's a bit of myth-making about him, because the people I spoke to, Flamingo said, actually, he was about the laziest person they knew. And although he was a kind of figurehead, the work was done by other people. Now, the question is, did he know? Did he know that it was funded? Now, it finished in 1965, and I believe it's finished in 1965 because of things in America where a particular magazine called Rampart had discovered that magazines were being funded by the CIA. And MI6 got worried and they pulled the plug. And suddenly all the funding went and Flamingo disappeared. Now it's a very interesting magazine. It's a popular magazine. It contained political interviews, but done very subtly. But there are also things like interviews with Malcolm X, which was very unusual at the time. So it's a very interesting magazine of that time, and it begs lots of questions about intelligence involvement.
Thank you. So one of the things you said 4 times is, did they know? And speaking of that, leads us nicely on to James, because did you know? And when you were commissioned at the time to take photographs for Drum Magazine and Flamingo, what was that experience like, if you could tell us about it?
It was interesting. I was already familiar with the Daily Graphic, having started as a first photojournalist or photographer on the Graphic in 1950. I had my own ever young studio, as well as doing freelance work for other papers. And then Drum came in around about 52, to Ghana. Started earlier in South Africa and then on the east coast of Africa. But later, I've forgotten the personality who actually came and established it. If you may know, from Mr. Smith, Anthony Smith. He was the one who came to establish graphic in the Drum in Ghana. And he got in touch with me in my studio. And later, when Jim Bailey, the proprietor, actually came to see how Drum was going, he came to live in a hotel next to my studio. So he introduced me, the two of us, and somehow it seems as if, there was some fire between the two of us. He was jolly and, always ready to learn, always ready to be inquisitive, finding out things. He didn't believe what was European, British, distance and so on. He was always wearing short knickers and would come down and talk to you. Would even taste whatever you are eating. So we got on very well, and I was given, you have to take some pictures with Drum. So more or less, I started giving them some of my own portraits, and then started to do stories for them. And in fact, it seemed as if I was their employee. As far as I can remember, I worked for them as an employer for 1 month, as far as I can remember. Otherwise, I had my studio and always served them as a freelance. But I knew what they wanted. I studied the old drums. I didn't go into color because the whole time I was in Ghana, I didn't touch color. I didn't know anything about color, so I didn't aim for the covers as such, the inside stories and so on. That's a special story. The month that I worked with Drum as an employee, there was an editor called Henry Thompson. Normally, the editors do their own thing. They plan, and they ask the photographer, go and take me this picture, that picture, that picture. But it happened that Henry Thompson hinted me, I'm doing a story on hanging. Maybe this is a long story, but it's interesting to know. He said, I'm doing a story on hanging. And I said, hanging? He said, this is up my street. A photographer with your studio, how does hanging come to your street? And I said, look, you see the James Fort prisons where the hanging takes place. When I'm sitting in my studio retouching or working, James Fort prison is right in front of me. And when anybody is going to be hanged, right from the documents on the person from the court the prisons, wherever he's kept, right down to the time that the person is hanged, is kept together. And there are people in charge of these things. And when the time comes for hanging, there are policemen or CID men who will make sure that the person who was tried in court and sentenced is the same person in prison to be hanged, because the finger marks and all the details are there. And these people check right down to the last minute before they are hanged. When they are hanged, they are there for 1 hour to die forever. And they can't sit in the prisons. So they come out and sit in my studio. So, all the hangings that went on, I had an idea, or I knew how it happened. I knew when priests go in to pray for the people, or traditional rulers, traditional fetish people go in to pray, or Muslims go in to pray for the people. And when I gave them a hint of what I knew, he said, all right, we'll do it. So the whole month or so, we have to follow these things and follow the action at the gate to see the movements and everything, and I covered all that, plus followed the Black Maria that took the body to the cemetery. I had a drum motorcycle and followed right up and did it. So drum's attitude or drum's style of work or coverage is a bit different. And you have to know it. And you have to be strong enough to cover, because anything can happen to you. When I went to the cemetery, the warders and the prisoners alone in the ward, and then a photographer following them. Anything could have happened to me, and these things are all there. I did this. Not only that, I did other stories as well. And I got very close to drum. I did my own nice pictures, and which the editor, one of the editors, came to England and asked me to send it. And they were my own pictures of my son carrying 2 bottles. A son, he was about 4 or 5 months old. And when he was standing there, so I sent the negatives, and it was sold to Black Star Agency, Black Star Photo Agency. And they published it and paid me some money. But when it got to Independence, because of my contact with them, because of that picture, they asked me to represent the agency during the independence, which was through drum. And in fact, before drum came, there was no idea of such magazines publishing pictures. So even though I didn't work for them full time, I was of a different level of photography. I had my studio photography, I had my journalistic photography, and that extra, which makes drum a new thing in Africa. I was also there. So we got on very well. We got on very well with drum. And when I was coming to England, I consulted him, and he said, oh, no, it's not England I want you here as a photographer. If you are any use for me, it's here. But later he found I was already arranging to leave. So he got in touch with his sister to look after me if I didn't succeed in London. But somehow things got so well. Jim Bailey got knighted by the Queen. The wife wrote to me from South Africa to join them at a party after Buckingham Palace. They were going to be entertained somewhere. I was the only black person. I joined them, I took photographs, and it was different. But then I had drum to push me to do things or to open doors for me, like photographing Muhammad Ali. Today, I can boast and say, if I had photographed the legend, then I'm also a legend. They arranged in the office, so they showed me where he was training to fight Brand London. So I left, I was in Kent, and I left and went, and at that time I had lined up a model that I was going to do for the cover. But they said, all right, take a small recording machine and be the interviewer. So she came with me, and because she was dressed, like a model, the attraction went on to her. But she was the one who spoke to Muhammad Ali all the time. I knew, and I found that I could have asked him to do anything for me. He was so cooperative that he would have, but I didn't talk to him at all. I just went about photographing. And when he won, the secretary in the drum office arranged for us to go to the hotel to meet him. And that was another thing, people there wanting to see him, taking his autograph and so on. I didn't say anything, I just photographed. And it was, but the thing is that it was Drum magazine and the push, the attitude of Drum and the doors that Drum opened for me, that has made me sit here today and show you my pictures. So many, I started from 1947, 49, and then coming here, 59, stayed 10 years and so on. But nobody heard of James Barnor, but I did work closely with Drum. They opened the way. And the Drum ideas were there. I was close to the editors. We worked with Henry Ofori, Henry Thompson. I didn't work with Cameron Dodu, but there was another editor. And, you have to cooperate. Whatever you are, the editor is the editor. And you get the ideas of Drum mentality or target through the editors. And you add yours as well. And no doubt, I think I got on because of Drum. The covers, when I came here, I went to college. First, I was doing color. And then I said, go to school, go to school. So I went to school where I met an artist who was a photographic teacher. He was in charge of photography. But he was an artist before he came. So I developed this fashion or showing out from, the qualities of a model, posing a model, the dresses and so on. Something like more art than technique came into my style. And it was Drum that gave me those assignments to photograph the models. At that time, we didn't talk about even makeup, special makeup at all, you know, just the ordinary listen. And but the colors that they wore and how we posed them, the locations that were selected. This was something, this girl was, Rima was the first model that I got for drum, you know. But this was, after the color, you try to do some black and white, and you get ideas and do it, you know. So all these join up to produce what has today made me James Barnor. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, that's a hard act to follow. I don't have any stories about Muhammad Ali, sorry. I think what's really beautiful is there's a lot of different individuals that conspired together to create these histories, these legacies that we didn't know we'd be here today talking about. And it made complete sense to ask June to join this discussion because she is evidence of that evolution from print media, showing there was demand. You've got 20,000 circulation at one point for both Flamingo, and drum was much higher. It showed the government they had to sit up and listen, that people want to hear, people want to see themselves reflected. So June, then your career, it would be really great to start with what publications did you grow up with and how did it influence working in broadcasting and becoming a journalist?
Yeah, of course. Well, I mean, my mother loved drum, and I think for that generation of Ghanaians who really were the sort of the first set of young people post-independence, you know, having that imagery for them was so important. And so I was lucky that I grew up with those sorts of publications in the house. And actually, for many years, she had every issue of Ebony magazine. I mean, in fact, I've got to ask her what she's done with it, because the archive is incredible. From when she was a teenager right through to when I was probably about 16, she bought it every month. And my mother is perhaps one of the most organized people. She's got a collection of family photos that could rival your archive, James. And so everything was perfectly documented in terms of year, month. You know, you asked her for something, she'd know where to find it. And so I grew up with all of these amazing black publications in the home, even though there weren't that many outside of the home back then. My mother bought the African ones as well as the American ones. So I was lucky in that she was very aware of making sure that we had imagery of ourselves and imagery that reflected the black experience that we knew, in that we had prominent members of our family. We had doctors, we had lawyers, you know, we had all of that. So whatever we were being told outside that black people were supposed to be, there was so much to counter that in my home. So I grew up with a wonderful idea of what it meant to be black. And then in terms of publications that I bought myself, Right On. Do you remember Right On magazine? You're probably too young. Do you remember it?
Yeah, I know it, but I don't remember.
She said, I know it. Well, it was an amazing magazine that had like sort of early hip-hop culture and R&B, and it was a sort of the magazine of the early sort of noughties, late 90s. And then obviously, you know, we had all of the British hip-hop magazines. I was very much into that. And then Smash Hits. You know, Smash Hits was such a key part of my life, my God. And then when I started in television, I got to start working for Smash Hits, which was such a big deal. They used to have this massive concert every year called the Smash Hits Poll Winners Party. And having grown up watching it, to then be able to present it myself. I remember the first one I ever did, I couldn't believe it. I literally pinched myself. So yeah, those magazines definitely meant a lot.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And then the next question to ask you is also about your love of James Barnor's work, because you're very familiar with it, which is a great coincidence.
I am, and I'm lucky to have a few of them in my home as well. So they bring me much joy. All I can say is thank you. Honestly, Mr. Barnor, what you have done is incredible in terms of being there to capture the birth of a nation and to document history unfolding, and in such a way where every image of yours, and that speaks to who you are as a human being, just captures the humanity of these incredible people that you were shooting, these incredible people who, it's so clear, just trusted you from the get-go. So for me to be able to see that, and to you as well, Bianca, for working so closely with Mr. Barnor to bring it all together at the beginning, and to see this show, which obviously I was lucky to see in Ghana when it opened, travel. It's incredible, and now the world gets to experience this. And I think, we were talking before we came on stage here, you were talking about how much you learnt from just going through the archives and hearing Mr. Barnor recount so many of these incredible stories. I think everybody else that gets to sit with these images is also learning. And I, for one, there's so much I didn't know about Ghanaian history, and I thought I knew quite a lot, that I'm sort of discovering. So it's amazing, and I'm just so glad that so many people are getting to appreciate this amazing work.
Thank you very much. Sometimes I feel inside me that if there was any recognition, it could or should have come when I was 60, when I was 65, when I was strong enough and I could cash in and I had the strength and do things. But
we needed the example of ever young. Yeah. It had to be now.
Yes, sorry about ever young. But I'm tempted to go through some of these pictures as they roll along.
Okay.
Yeah.
This tropical bundle, Thompson, sometimes I'll find the model, and sometimes the model will be directed from the drum office to me. Thompson was directed to me. When she came, I thought straight away she looked like a Ghanaian, she behaved like a Ghanaian, and the name Thompson was a Ghanaian name. So, I was tempted to speak Ga with her, but it didn't work. But we got on very well. We only met once. We didn't meet before. I think we only met once. And she had only one dress, and we went to a studio. I worked in the studio, so I had the key to go there and use it to do my shots. Normally, I prefer daylight. Nice color, daylight, and vicinities or important places, Trafalgar Square, so that you know where you are. You can identify with the place that you take the pictures. But this was a Sunday, very cold day, and we went to the studio. And she had only one, and I was trying to do something. When you take the color, then you have to take black and white as well. Black and white to show the girl's interest. You get the picture for the cover in color, and then you take some black and white and ask her stories and so on and so forth. So I was doing the black and white, and I think I came out and saw the red post outside. And I said, yes, you have a scarf and the red. So I asked her, could you kindly pop out so that I take one or two pictures? It was cold. And Grayson Road was quiet. But she said, yes, I'll do it. She put on a thin leather gloves and came up with me. And I sort of posed there between the tree and the post in the back with a scarf. And I thought it was good. I didn't leave it there. I went down and brought a ladder. There was a bus stop. But the bus stop, the numbers were up. And to show a bus, the numbers, she had to go up. So I brought a ladder and made her climb, so in the cold. And she did. Sometimes the models give in to you, when you apply some technique or, persuasion, you can get them to do things. And she was very good. And we managed to do that. And now this is my only connection with Flamingo. And there was an editor, a Ghanaian editor called Ellis Comey. He was working on it and he tried to get me. So I managed to talk to this girl and she agreed. I traveled from Kent to London. We went to Balham Park or somewhere. It was just a park. And I started taking pictures of her. And I saw somebody with a bicycle. And I begged the person, borrowed the bicycle, let her hold it, lean on the bicycle. That's a nice picture too, with her and the bicycle. But the color and her dress, for the cover, the bicycle didn't come in, but she was so good. Now, that picture, after the block had been made, she rang me and said, I don't like my picture to be published anymore. But I made up my mind I wasn't going to answer her, and I did. And I didn't, and so the thing went through. When I went to Ghana and came back some 20 years back, she saw me on a network and said, are you Mr. Barnor, the one who used to take photographs in the 50s, and so and so and so? I was one of your models. My name is so and so. What? And I started pouring her pictures on the net. And people said, oh, you're so beautiful, because the net, nobody knew who was writing. It was a network that nobody knew. They were all writing and, but when I started putting her pictures, and then we connected, and recently the editor of British Vogue spoke exactly what I thought about that image. And I was very pleased. She was like a Ghanaian, but to me, I think the most beautiful face that I had worked with. Beautiful face. She could be beautiful, she could be lovely, and so on. But the face, I photographed her a lot of times, and also at a wedding and other occasions. Everybody wanted to hug her. Everyone, and at the moment I've got it on my computer, when you look at the lines on the lips, you want to go further than that,
It's a good segment to ask if there's audience questions.
So that's my closest connection with drum, with Flamingo. Unfortunately, about 6 or 8 months ago, she passed away in New York.
Yeah.
Wow.
And we watched a funeral online.
Wow.
Is there any other, because let's see, the Brixton market I didn't do any, other thing like.
For Flamingo, sure.
No, that's another. The face is just good. And I did a whole roll or two on her so many dresses, the customary or traditional dress, and also the face. And when I'm photographing, I try to make the model look at me, so we see the eye and we make contact. And this was I alone and her, like the other one, in the same studio. I tried to get this. And what else? After that, we have to get pictures of her in black and white. And I asked her, and she was interested in music and so on. So I arranged with a band that was playing at one of London University campuses, at the weekend. So I went with her, but when we went, they didn't know her, they hadn't rehearsed with her, so we had to wait till they finished the session on the night, and then we posed something and we sang. So there's a picture of her behind the drum and so on, and we had some lovely pictures.
Wow.
Mm-hmm. And that's another. This, they had a beauty contest. Jamaican or West Indian girls, they had a beauty contest, and it was the editor who went with me. The editor was going, and we went together. I had a camera, and when they were doing it, I told the editor, this girl will win. I told the editor this, and so when she won, I had to pin her down and make an appointment to come to the studio. And the earrings and these things, I used to buy these things at Petticoat Lane Market.
Wow.
And I used to try it on the models, which one fits or this, and so on. And I tried this on her, but I liked the full face. That was, a full face covering the cover. And she was there. As for this one editor, not rejected, but said she looked more European than African. The picture I presented to him looked more European than, we had to do a lot of fighting behind this before we get the covers. So I should go and try again. And I tried, and it was accepted. But I kept, and this was the replacement. But later, I sent the same picture to another editor who came to drum, and he accepted quickly. And so, so 2 or 3 pictures of her were used on the drum. The girl who won the beauty contest is the same one here, another Helen. Now, the picture there was the lineup of the finals of the competition. The lineup, those who competed, more than that, but those who competed. I think this is one of the 3 different shots of the same girl on the cover. She's in Nigeria now. 1 year, she got in touch with me and she said she was coming. I said, come, we will host you. But she didn't come, because at the time, she was in big parts in television and, very much in the news. And when I did her pictures for drum, and I did many. One, she came to, the one she's sitting in a car, the same model, she's the one sitting in the car. And she came with her boyfriend. They drove all the way from London to Rochester. That's it. And I took her into the swimming pool. But it was another time, and I took that picture of her, in Johannesburg. Or, is it Johannesburg? Or, her picture, the exhibition we had, her picture was outside, big, when I didn't think that it could be so. It had been exhibited in Harvard University in America before, 2010. But I didn't think that, but when in South Africa, it was outside the studio to attract visitors to the exhibition. As I say, this is the first model I took for drum. There wasn't anything special, so we went to Battersea Park, and the runabout and all these things. I said, all right, I jump on it. So we took a few, and the fun and the drawing of the horses and her smile made the cover. And that was my first cover for drum.
Can I ask quickly if there's any audience questions, and then we come back to some images, if that's okay?
Any question? That's the same girl here.
Bianca.
Yes.
Okay, over here.
Hello. As I understand it,
I think they're bringing the microphones.
Yeah.
Hello. As I understand it, Drum magazine was very anti-apartheid, and during this period, the 1960s, was probably the worst period of the South African regime, there was the Sharpeville massacre in 1963, and I was just wondering whether you were conscious, because Drum magazine was campaigned against apartheid. I just wondered if you were aware of that, of their editorial position, whether that was relevant to your work. What was your work? Was it promoting black consciousness at all, or black people, in terms of what was going on in South Africa at the time, and whether that was part of what you were doing?
When I was working for Drum or in Ghana, we didn't have any trouble with South Africa at all, or we didn't even know what was going on. In fact, it was Jim Bailey, as friends, he was hinting me about certain things that were going on there. He said, the way we are walking together in the middle of the night, or this corner or that side, if it were in South Africa, it would be, not accepted, and so on and so forth. But how the apartheid, we didn't feel it so much. But when we did, it was through Nkrumah, and it didn't affect us. But, I would say, if anything, Nkrumah would have helped the South Africans or organized something against them. But unfortunately, it didn't happen. But, the apartheid didn't affect us in Ghana. Whatever they do there, the drum was going on, and Jim Bailey was standing on, he was fighting the apartheid, using the drum, to fight. But again, his father made his money from South African apartheid, gold, this thing, and so he was careful. And yet, the regime that he has started fought the apartheid through the publication of Drum. They didn't fear. But later, when a Drum started getting involved in the Ghanaian or Nigerian politics, and so on, and then they started banning the Drum. So he did one way to interest or get the Ghanaian people to bring in their money, to own part of the Drum. Say Ghana Drum will belong to him and also Ghanaians. And then they won't stop it, but it went on, and later, I think they banned Drum in many places. I remember when Henry Thompson was the editor, when we did that hanging thing, the editor, he was going with the opposition of, was it Nkrumah? He was going with the opposition. And Bailey heard it in South Africa. He came back negotiated, and there was a sort of, please, I don't want my paper to be involved in this, get this and go away. And I photographed them saying goodbye to one another. I photographed them in front of drum office, you know, shaking hands, and that was the, you know, end of Henry Thompson. Later, he joined, you know, he concentrated on that party, and later came here to be the PRO of the government. Wow. You know, so apartheid and drum and Ghana, it didn't affect us as such. And Bailey didn't stop because of what the government was doing. He carried on doing his own thing.
So I have two quick anecdotes before Stephen about that Cameron Dodu wanted to share, which is, the first one is, one of the reasons why he left the Ghana Broadcasting Corporation was because when he was working there, he got some faxes through that were images of people being shot in South Africa. And it was so terrifying for him that this was happening that he was aware of Drum, he was aware of the magazine. So when he was also approached, it was one of the reasons why he felt aligned with Drum's mission of talking about, you know, Black Lives Matter, essentially, South African Black lives in general anyway. And so that was one of the things that motivated him to become editor for Drum, is worth mentioning. And then the second comment about the impact that Drum had in relation to talk about apartheid and anti-apartheid movements is that in 1960, there was funding at the time, when Cameron Dodu talks about the difficulty of working between 1960s, 1965, is because there was the Mulgate scandal, which was the South African government that funded, they put lots of money into giving different African countries and magazines to be aligned with the apartheid regime and to support it in publications and in print. And so one of the reasons why Cameron Dodu had difficulties with the government is because he spoke out against, at the time it was Kofi Buzia, who was then president of Ghana, against why would they take this money from South Africa when Ghana should be encouraging and be seen as this place of Pan-Africanism. So just to give some more information about actually the impact that, you know, South Africa and the apartheid regime had as well. And then Stephen, I think you wanted to add something.
Well, Drum was published in various countries, so there are different versions of it. And one thing is, the very existence of Drum was a triumph because of the apartheid system, which wanted to close everything down, but they didn't want to appear as being that repressive. So they allowed certain things to happen. And one of the reasons it existed, I think, is because of the design. If you look at Drum and you look at Flamingo, they're very similar in design. These are popular magazines, you know, pretty girls on the cover and all the rest of it. It was kind of aping popular magazines, and it was done deliberately. And it's kind of, the propaganda that's in them is subtle. It's not bashing you over the head. It's inserting bits and pieces, interviews with potential politicians, quite benign reports of what's going on in different countries and in South Africa and all those kind of things. So and on one level, the fact that they existed, as I said, is a triumph. And they did attempt to close them down. The apartheid thing was very strong amongst MI6. They were against it, which if, you know, people think that intelligence services were very right-wing and all the rest, but there were certain sections, because they're not all the same within it, and they did help the ANC. That's very clear. They provided finance which the ANC did not know where it came from. And they provided means to get ANC people into South Africa and out. And they supported things. They didn't, as far as I'm aware, there's no evidence that they directly supported Drum. We're not quite sure where Bailey got all his money from. You're absolutely correct, because his father had a lot of money. And Bailey's father had actually worked with British intelligence before the Second World War. So it's maybe, but there's no proof on that. But as I said, the design of it was deliberate, and it was very successful. It was very popular. So you would have fashion. You would have all clothes and everything that went with that. And then in I think about 64, I noticed a change in Flamingo, that the Foreign Office Information Department, which was semi-covert IRD, I can spot some of their material in the magazine. It becomes slightly more politicized, and you can see a change that is going on. So again, MI6 are playing a very subtle game. They are trying to support the ANC, they're trying to bring down apartheid, but they're not going to do it openly. And I think it's an interesting view, because you could bring it up today and say, what's going on with all these kind of things. And you have to remember that at that time there's this great ideological battle between whether it was right or wrong or whatever. It was going on between the Soviets and the West. Today you might argue there's no ideological battle. Who's interested in what China do in terms of culture? Not really. So there's less of this, but lots of this was going on, and it was in all kinds of areas, because one of the ones was in music, which you're going to do a next session about. There was something called the transcription service, which the person who ran it knew that it was funded by the CIA. And the transcription service in London became the place where a lot of South African musicians and musicians from Nigeria in particular came in the mid-60s. And one of my favourite African bands was Assegai. And they came over in, I think, 65, and they gravitated to the transcription service. And it was a kind of meeting place for refugees, political activists. And again, these CIA people and MI6 people in amongst all of this. And it was in art, in music, in magazines. It's a big, big thing, which we're only starting to really scratch the surface of.
Where does King Kong come into this? You remember King Kong from South Africa? They came and they never went back.
Well, the one that is, I don't know,
the players, the actors of King Kong.
Chris McGregor's Brotherhood of Breath, they came over in 65 from South Africa. They were exiled from apartheid, and they became very prominent in the British jazz scene. And they were helped. They didn't know what was behind it, but there was the student house, which was funded indirectly by the intelligence services. And there were other things, and you could get to college, and there were conferences. They were all funded. In the late 1950s, there were dozens of conferences in Africa, in Europe, about Africa and culture and literature, and they were all funded by the CIA.
Can I take one more question, please?
Hi, it's really fascinating to hear the stories behind the making of the photographs, but also the role of public broadcast. A question for June, actually. So thinking about BBC now as a public broadcaster and your kind of role there now, years ago, David Attenborough, if you watched his images of different parts of the world, he was kind of putting across, to some extent, colonialism. In terms of where we are now, how do you see these kinds of, the role of the public broadcaster being able to change its possibilities for representation, going beyond representation? I'm really interested to see, where is it now as a public broadcaster?
Yeah, well, I think now the role is very much ensuring that as a public service broadcaster, that we authentically reflect the nation back to itself. And I think that if you look at the kind of programming that has been very successful in terms of diverse programming anyway, the shows that have really been able to get that authentic voice across have not only resonated with the audiences that they are about, but have also resonated with audiences not just in the UK, around the world. I would say Michaela Cole, I May Destroy You is a perfect example of that. You know, I don't think that show would have been commissioned 5 years ago. I think that it's very symbolic of where we are now. And again, even with Steve's Small Acts, you know, that is very much about the Black British experience in a way that we haven't really seen on our screens, not enough of anyway, and not drama about that period of time. You know, there have been documentaries, but not a drama of that scale. So I think that the kinds of shows that are being commissioned, and then also the types of storytellers that are being given opportunities too. There is some great stuff that will be coming down the line in the next year or so, and now we've put a big financial investment behind that. I hope, anyway, that the type of new programming that will be coming through will definitely reflect the era that we're in now, which is about authentic representation.
To reflect on a little bit in seeing James's pictures, and like, thank you for your pictures. There's an element of joy in 1960s London that I haven't seen on BBC. So I love the Small Acts, I love all of that. But I want to see this double consciousness of African joy in Black Britishness. That's not coming through yet. So I love the programs you mentioned, but there's something really special about the joy in these images.
Yes.
And those stories, they're so lively.
But I think you got some joy in Lovers Rock. I mean, I think and I agree with you, we need more of it, because actually the Black British experience, the Black experience period, is steeped in joy, even with everything else that's come with it. Actually, that is one of the core, that's one of the core essence of being Black, is actually that Black joy. You know, if you go to a Black party, you know you are at a party full of Black people, in terms of how we express ourselves and the way we experience music, and the way even we are with food. Everything is so lively, and I think even with the trauma, even with everything else that has happened post slavery and onwards, the joy that was there before has lasted through the generations. And I think that is actually something we really have to teach the world, is how to be truly joyful, regardless of what's going on externally.
I would speak up for the BBC, because actually there were programs in the early 60s, and John Carew, Flamingo, he actually wrote some plays, I think about 63, 64, which were about the Black experience in Britain at that time. It's just that people forgotten, and we kind of rewrite history. But actually, the BBC did put this on. And some of it was exactly what you were saying about Black experience at that particular time. So, you know, the BBC, in fact, I think in the 60s was very good. It was actually much more radical than today. And it was willing to do things which it's not willing to do. And to put these kind of programs on in that period, immediately kind of after, well, there were riots in Bristol in 62, and there was the Notting Hill, etc., was quite a brave thing in a country that was clearly very racialist. But they did actually give a voice to a number of Black writers and actors. So, I mean, it's another part of the little hidden histories that we're kind of starting to dig out.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's conversation. I know there's more questions, but unfortunately, because of time and to be mindful, we'll have to end on that note. And the other people that I need to also say thank you to, which, thanks, Lizzie, for doing the sponsors and exhibition, because I would not have remembered that. That's great. Is to also say thank you to the team that helped put this together. And if it's okay to just read their names, of course, to Cameron Dodu for the interview, despite not being able to make it. Also really thank you to Jordan Page, to Mike Gohan, to Roisin McVeigh, to Kore Dodu, Cameron Dodu's son, who helped put everything together remotely. Of course, to James Barnor, to Lizzie Carey Thomas, thank you for the introduction, to Hannah Grima, and to Yesomi Yomolu. So thank you, everyone. Just to say that the final event is on the 11th of September. We're actually not talking about music. We're going to dance to music. I think there's a lot of talking. So please come if you can. And it will be announced on Monday by the end of the day. So look out for it on the website. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a good day.